Added disclaimer: I am not a doctor. Do not take my video as a formal medical or psychological diagnosis. Thank you. I was about 6 or 7 years old when I was diagnosed with ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactive disorder. I was diagnosed by my neurologist. It had actually taken a pretty long time to get to the root of the problem, and a lot of tests and a lot of doctors too, but my folks wanted to make sure. I have lived with ADHD my entire life. I have to take medication to control it. I've also done group therapy and individual therapy, but I stopped doing individual therapy a few years ago. The first medication they had me try was Ritalin, which was very popular in the 90s, as it was 99 or 2000 that I was diagnosed, and it didn't work for me at all. So I was then switched over to Adderall, and luckily it did not take very long for them to find the correct dosage for me. A lot of people will probably say that ADHD was severely overdiagnosed in the 90s, so how can I be sure that I actually have it? Well, because as I said, I went through a metric fuck ton of tests and doctors, and my parents took their time to do their research, and with the menagerie of tests, that was the diagnosis, and I'm confident in it. And yes, I do agree that ADHD was in fact overdiagnosed in the 90s, and it still has this issue quite a bit as well. But it also has the issue of people getting misdiagnosed as well, as there's a few things about ADHD that make it very difficult to diagnose. And especially in the 90s, as no one had much information about it. While it's been around since, the 1700s, it wasn't really common knowledge or mainstream knowledge for a very long time, so I don't think a lot of doctors were too familiar with it. Secondly, the symptoms of ADHD are common in a lot of psychological, psychiatric, and other neurological disorders like depression, bipolar, autism, Tourette's, etc., etc. And on top of that, those symptoms can also be mistaken for not desirable personality traits, but personality traits nevertheless. And lastly, people and doctors didn't really fully understand that ADHD was on a spectrum. That's actually more recently been discovered that it is on a spectrum, which can make it either super mild or insanely severe. So I think that probably explains pretty well why it was so prevalent in the 90s, and it's been kind of tapering off now. On a side note, I'm also female, obviously, and to have been diagnosed with ADHD even in the 90s was kind of weird, because it was quite widely believed that only males or boys of a school age could have ADHD. On top of this is that during the 90s, they actually thought it was a psychiatric problem as well. And most people didn't understand that it wasn't a psychiatric problem. It was actually neurological and neurobehavioral. So they kind of just took the word of a social worker or a psychologist or psychiatrist, or just someone who really wasn't qualified to give out such a diagnosis, and they kind of left it at that. My parents did all that they could to be sure of what the doctors were saying. And I do give my folks credit for that, and for not freaking out when that was the result of the test and the diagnosis. Despite this, for most of my life, I really couldn't talk about my diagnosis, not because of a lack of people around, but because people didn't really understand it, and I was also very ashamed of it, and of myself for it. I didn't feel like I should talk about it. I was embarrassed by it, and I didn't feel fully human because of it. I felt very subhuman, or defective, I think would be a better word. that I had to rely on a pill just to have a coherent thought in my head. It doesn't really bother me as much as it used to, but it still does bother me quite a bit. I still don't like talking about it. I'm still afraid of being judged and hated for it or being left for it. Dealing with this and being aware of it, I know deep down that I still have a very long journey ahead of me before I can honestly say that I am at peace with my diagnosis. The reason being I'm not at peace with it, and that I really can't honestly say that I am, is because ADHD is possibly one of the least understood or even least acknowledged disorders, in my opinion. Now, a lot of people will say that, oh, well, there's other disorders that are even less accepted and less understood, and while that is true, I can only speak on the one that I have, which is ADHD, and how I was treated. Now, ADHD and ADD, or attention deficit disorder, which was one of the past diagnoses that you could get, but that has been conflated into just being ADHD without the hyperactivity. It has a very nasty stigma that I don't think people really understand. And while people are like, oh, well, you're not bullied or shamed for it, people accept it more or less. I'm like, well, yeah, now they do, but they didn't. And a lot of people still don't know. There's also the simple fact that there are people who have absolutely no shame and have no problem berating you and, blaming you to your face for having a disorder that you never asked for, that you never wanted. You see, when you have ADHD, you aren't treated like others who have a better known or better accepted disorder, not in the slightest. You pretty much get treated like dog shit by most people, and you're ashamed for existing. Especially when you're a kid. See, at school, it being as hard as it is due to, the inattention and the impulsivity and everything else, plus the social aspects that, when you have ADHD, it doesn't really bode well for you. But you also have the teachers that look at you like you're a waste of time, and then you're shoved into the special ed classes, even though, you might be as smart as the honor roll kids, but even still, you're being treated like, you have 4 brain cells in your head and they're bouncing around your skull like the Windows screensaver. And while, as an adult, I do understand why this happened, and I do see why it was very helpful for me, as a kid, you don't see that, and you just think you're put in there because you're stupid. And there are teachers who will treat you like you're stupid. And those are the same teachers that brush you aside or will belittle you for needing help. And in some really bad cases, they'll actually scream and humiliate you in class. And as a kid, you start to see yourself as a waste of space as well. There's also a little thing called an IEP. Now, if you don't know what an IEP is, it's this little form that is put into your school transcripts to inform, allow, and to enforce the legal requirement that a school is meant to give accommodations to those with ADHD and ADD, as well as other similar disorders. And you were made aware of this as a student, that you got these accommodations, and those accommodations included, but weren't exactly limited to, being put in a different room away from other students, having any test or assignment read to you, as sometimes reading comprehension was a problem. You could get extra time on tests and assessments or assignments or projects, and there was one pretty big issue with it. And that was that you, the student, either had to ask the teacher for those accommodations to be enforced or put into place. Otherwise, they wouldn't be given to you at all. If they didn't just assume that you wanted them, you'd have to publicly ask for them. And some teachers did, refuse to give you those accommodations, which was very illegal, and it's still highly illegal in the States to do that. But it's very difficult to prove, as you can imagine. Or you would get the teachers who would crank up your disorder to level 9,000 and would treat you as if, you were severely mentally impaired and they would legitimately ask you flat out if you wanted your IEP accommodations and then list off all your accommodations in front of the class. Very loudly, mind you. And as you can imagine, this was seen as special treatment by your classmates, your peers, other kids, and it did not go unnoticed or unpunished at all. I mean, it wasn't bad enough that they were also looking at you like you were stupid because you had to leave the classroom at certain times into the special ed class. Or they, were just jealous and resentful of the accommodations that you got and they didn't get. And they would bully you for it. Would also make fun of you for, not understanding social subtleties, which is another symptom of ADHD. And that really made starting and building friendships incredibly hard, as no one wanted to be associated with you. And even when or if you did manage to get friends, it was especially hard as a teenager due to the mood swings that could happen and the anxiety and just a lot of other shit. I mean, even with medication, you always ran the risk of having just an overwhelming day and just losing your shit. And when that happened, you were suddenly that asshole who couldn't handle their fucking shit, and then you'd go off on your friend because they would just set you off after one of those days, and then all of a sudden you were the jackass, and you would lose the friendships over it. And, as a teenager, you lost one friend, you lost them all. So a lot of the time, when you got this diagnosis, you would feel broken, alone, unloved, and rejected. And while school life really sucked, home life was no cakewalk either, because you weren't at the levels where you should have been. The level of independence as you should have been. You weren't meeting the same milestones as your peers or in the same time, and they would see you struggling, not only in school but also at home, also socially, and there would just be a lot of fights. When a parent just sees their child struggling, and fuck, no parent wants to see that, they get very frustrated because they don't know what to do. They don't know how to help. And honestly, I don't think anyone really took that into consideration, that it's not just the kid that's being affected, it's everyone. And the entire family in that house are just trying to deal with this disorder. And that's just never fun, and that's never easy. So home life wasn't perfect. And as for the rest of the people, extended family, friends of the family, parents of your friends, and even total strangers, they would be some of the worst motherfuckers out there. And they'd always have some bullshit to say. As a kid, they would glare at you and your parents and make nasty, snide comments if, you had a meltdown and you were just a little kid. And those strangers, they would just shame your parents for trying to help you live your normal life. I mean, they would shame you for, poisoning your child, or, all that shit. And all your parents were doing was trying to help you. That didn't make shit any easier. And as you got older, you became a teenager, and then those same people would fucking belittle you to your face and tell you to just fucking grow out of it. And, you're so-and-so years old, and blah, 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 you shouldn't be doing, insert whatever they had a problem with here. Or they might even call you an entitled brat if you got overwhelmed in public, or just couldn't handle it, or were having a bad day. And as an adult, well, let's just say it doesn't get much nicer. I've had coworkers talking behind my back of how I was very strange, and when they thought I couldn't hear them, but I could fucking hear them. I've had, teachers. My senior year of high school, I had a teacher speak to me in the most condescending voice that I can fucking muster, and wasn't even a teacher, it was a teacher's aide in my algebra for upperclassmen math class, and I was pretty fine in that class. I was okay, did all right. The teacher was a decent guy, but this teacher's aide, she was like in her 50s or something, and apparently she saw my IEP and immediately thought that I was, severely mentally handicapped slash severely mentally impaired, like stereotypically so. And when she spoke to me, she would speak to me like this, like, do you understand? Do you want me to read this to you? Do you understand what the teacher is saying to you? And after fucking months of this, of her talking to me like that every single day, all through class, I just snapped. I told her, get away from me. I don't need your help. I don't want your help. Please go help one of the other students that has their hand raised. Go away. I don't need this shit read to me. I know what I'm doing. And her response was to pat me on the fucking head. Most condescending response I've ever had in my life. It's been 10 plus years and that shit still pisses me off. Luckily, I was a bit of a teacher's pet, so I didn't really get in trouble, but up until very recently, about earlier this year, late last year, I fully accepted and was used to the fact that most people flat out refuse to understand my disorder, and a lot of them refuse to believe or even acknowledge my disorder was, legitimate, and they would convince themselves of whatever they wanted that would make them feel better. And after a while, I just kind of gave up on explaining it. I mean, it mostly falls on deaf ears anyway, so what was the point? I think it's pretty safe to say that most people with my disorder or similar disorders felt the same. The ADHD bullshit bingo meme that I use in this video is a lot more accurate than I care to admit. And on the screen now are the memes that I would find, and are pretty good examples of what I grew up with hearing and even seeing in, online media when it came to ADHD. And keep in mind, this shit was normal. This was just, accepted. That this is what people thought of you, and you just kind of went with it. And honestly, I hated myself for a very long time. And I was lonely all the time. And I hated being lonely, but all I really wanted was to feel heard and understood and accepted. For me, I just wanted to be enough. But I was just too scared. I was so fucking scared. I was scared to talk to anyone about my disorder. I was ashamed of it. I felt that it was my fault. I pretty much just saw myself as a bad kid, and I didn't know why. I didn't really understand why. I mean, I knew I had a disorder and I had to take medication for it, but I didn't really see the correlation until I was about 10 or 11 years old. And when that happened, I just felt like I didn't deserve friends, or a partner for that matter, because I was defective, or at least that's how I saw myself. It was just this broken thing, and I just wasn't worth anyone's time. And when all you hear is, just put down after put down and shit like, why can't you just be normal? Honestly, that fucking hurt a lot more than I care to admit as well. Or, you hear shit like, your partner is gonna have to be a saint for you, And I know that doesn't sound bad, but when it's referring to you and just how you are, it fucking stings. I really don't like admitting this, but I do want to be as honest as possible. But I literally saw my ADHD as a curse. And I mean that in, very literally. I'm not misusing the term. It was my curse from a vengeful, wrathful God. And before I converted to paganism, I was a Catholic Christian, and I would pray to the Christian God to make me normal. And I would do this as I would very quietly cry myself to sleep at night. And this happened on more occasions than I would, more occasions than I am comfortable of admitting. Suffice to say, it happened several times a week, quite regularly. I hated myself that much, and I hated what I was, and that's how I referred to myself. I wasn't a she, I was a what. I was an it, and that was all because I had to rely on a pill just to function. And for a very long time, that's all I was doing, that's all I could do. Function. And it didn't get better for a very, very long time.